I'm Thanasi Cabanas. You're listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's Foreign Affairs podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the apparent rapprochement between Turkey and Egypt. And I'm joined by Nick Danforth, a senior visiting fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and Michael Wahid Hanna, a senior fellow here at the Century Foundation. Thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So maybe, Nick, you can get us started by just setting the scene. What has been happening between these two mid-level powers in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, I should say from the beginning that I'm really excited to be on here and hear what an actual Egypt expert has to say about this. Because I think from the perspective of those of us who were focused on Turkey, it really seemed like there actually wasn't that much going on initially. This seemed like a PR stunt from Ankara. The rapprochement between Turkey and Egypt happened in the context of Erdogan realizing things were going badly for him diplomatically, realizing Turkey was isolated in the region, at odds with a host of countries, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, trying to break out of this isolation, but not being really committed to changing any of the policies that created the isolation in the first place. And we can talk about what those are. So this happened in the context of Erdogan saying that, Ankara announcing that it was going to have a rapprochement with Israel. It started talks with Greece. At one point, more implausibly, it was even saying it was on the verge of a rapprochement with Armenia. And initially, this all seemed like spin coming from Ankara. And this was accentuated when the Turkish government had a habit of putting out falsely optimistic statements, sometimes including concrete claims about how they were on the verge of signing a maritime delimitation agreement with Egypt, or selling drones to Saudi Arabia, which were quickly contradicted by officials in those countries. So I start all this off by saying that when we entered into this, as the talk of rapprochement grew, particularly driven by Turkish media leaks to pro-government newspapers in Turkey, I, for one, and I think a lot of other Turkey-focused analysts were very dismissive of it. It seemed like this was just another stage in this charm offensive.
And by the way, this is happening when? This is beginning in the winter, like before the U.S. election, or what's the time frame where this started to change?
And the election occurs. Turkey announces it's also prepared to have a reset with the United States under Biden, which people found implausible. Last fall, you begun to hear noises from Ankara about first intelligent contacts with Egyptian officials, and gradually growing more optimistic statements about the rapprochement they might have with Egypt in conjunction with the other claims they were making about rapprochements all around the region.
This sort of came onto my radar a few weeks ago with the announcement about Egyptian exiles in Turkey. Michael, maybe you can also help us set the scene by telling us what happened there, and with an eye towards explaining the significance of this exile dissident and media presence in Istanbul.
Sure. I think, I'm skeptical and have been skeptical as well. The one thing for me that has tended to shift me away from thinking that this is simply a PR stunt is how bitter this relationship was. If we think about relationships in the region, Egypt and the UAE are maybe going to be at the end of the list of the countries where I would think that a plausible rapprochement might be on the agenda. If we remember how partisan Turkey was in Egypt, right? I mean, Turkey took sides in Egyptian politics, and Erdogan seemed to have some kind of emotional connection with the aftermath of the coup. Obviously, he's the leader of a country; he's being pragmatic, but Erdogan would flash the four-finger sign that came out of the Rabaa protest and then massacre in August 2013. So
this is viewed as like a Muslim Brotherhood solidarity in opposition to the leader of Egypt.
Right. And so, an incredibly bitter relationship. And so to see Turkish media and media elites begin to shift that discourse and to talk about Egypt in pragmatic terms. From my perspective, I wondered what was up. Is this preparing for potential shifts in Turkish policy? And you mentioned one that we did see, right? I mean, we haven't seen too much in terms of actual concrete policy change. I would say the thing that did precede this media step, which I'll touch on in just a second, was growing pragmatism between Turkey and Egypt and Libya, right? That's a place where both sides seem to have come off of their more maximalist visions for the country, came close to potentially kind of getting into more direct conflict, and have stepped back from that, and now are seemingly being more pragmatic and have been in contact. So that, for me, was the first place where we saw something where we could say things looked different. And you mentioned the steps in the media. The largest organizations of Egyptian exiles, particularly from the Muslim Brotherhood, are in Turkey. They've established these satellite channels, which are obviously vociferously anti-Sisi and Sisi regime, and have a constituency. People watch these channels, and Turkey seems to have told these channels and their presenters to tone down their criticism of Egypt and to tone down the nature of their criticism of Sisi himself. And obviously this caused a big stir within the exile community, fears about what this might mean for the future. But more importantly, for our present discussion, a seemingly real shift in how they were approaching an issue that is of high importance to Egypt. Egypt has been imploring Turkey to deal with these channels. It doesn't like this, real opposition. It has taken over internally its own media superstructures, and there is no independent media left in Egypt. And this has been a sore spot for the Sisi regime. And they now, I think, are in a kind of wait and see policy, writ large, but also with respect to this policy shift as well. So what does this mean? What is this going to look like in practice?
And I want to ask you both, maybe Nick can answer this first, about the significance of the Turkey-Egypt relationship. When we look at the region, especially over the last 10 years, where there's been so much intervention by not just international powers, but by regional powers, Egypt seems to be in a lower tier of importance than, so I think of Turkey, Iran, UAE, and Saudi as being in the upper tier of regional countries that are intervening around the region. Egypt is a little lower down, although they've been active in the war in Libya, especially. And so I'm wondering what's important about this relationship, and how much significance does it have in terms of thinking about Turkey's aspirations to be a leader in the former Ottoman space?
So I think that's a key question and a good opportunity to step back and look at how the Turkish-Egyptian relationship has gotten enmeshed in a much broader dynamic. Because as Michael said, it started out, there was a very personal dynamic to the tensions between Erdogan and Sisi. There was an ideological element, all stemming from the coup that brought down Morsi. And Erdogan not just seeing this kind of ideologically as a Muslim Brotherhood ally being toppled, but also in the context of a series of coups in Turkey against pro-Islamist parties, seeing this as very personal. And there was a coup attempt against Erdogan in 2016. There was a real identification between him and Morsi, which, as Michael said, has driven this in a way that now his pragmatism is struggling to compensate for. But what I think made this so relevant for the question you asked is that very quickly that the Turkish-Egyptian hostility got caught up in evolving dynamics in the Eastern Mediterranean. And when you had, in 2010, 2011, natural gas discoveries in the corner of the Eastern Mediterranean between Cyprus and Israel and Egypt, you gradually had a developing relationship between between these three countries first. Later, other countries got involved. Greece became a partner, looking for ways to exploit this natural gas, export it to Europe. In Turkey, Israel in particular hoped to make Turkey a part of these efforts, hoped to actually export this gas through Turkey. But unfortunately, Turkey, at this point, not only had bad relationships with Egypt, also undergoing renewed tensions with Israel, doesn't even recognize the Cypriot government. And so this, evolved into the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, initially kind of purely focused on energy, took on a geopolitical slant and became a way for a number of countries in the region that were increasingly worried, rightly or wrongly, by Turkey's behavior, to begin to develop a forum in which they could articulate and expand on their common interests in, and again, increasingly became seen as containing Turkey. And so that's, I think that's the dynamic that made this, and then the fact that you then had Saudi Arabia and the UAE coming in on Israel's side when this conflict spilled over to Libya, as the extent that Greece got involved. You had France coming in on Greece's side. And so this, from Turkey's point of view, what began as a bilateral conflict with Egypt quickly became part of something much bigger, which they were on the wrong end of. It brought together not only a lot of regional countries, but also pretty much all of the US's allies and partners in the region and a number of EU countries. So they, one would have thought at that point, maybe the move would have been to repair relationships with the United States and the EU to try to break out of their isolation. Instead, they almost seem to have taken the reverse approach. Egypt now seems to be the one country which they've made kind of plausible and consistent, and as Michael said, increasingly concrete efforts to improve ties with. But now you kind of have a reverse dynamic wherein the fact that Egypt is part of this multilateral and increasingly diverse coalition is actually now going to be a new obstacle to Turkey and Egypt improving ties.
Well, and I guess from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like Egypt is going to trade away its position on the delineation of natural gas borders just because Turkey tones down the vociferous criticism of Sisi on exile TV stations.
Well, so on that point, one thing to note here, and it's just a side note. So, Greece and Egypt have delineated a maritime boundary, but I think, and this is the Egyptian perspective of what that meant, is that in so doing, Egypt did not compromise Turkey's claims to its continental shelf in delineating a maritime boundary. And so Egypt believes that it has sort of dealt with Turkey in good faith. So this comes in this broader context of easing of relations and tensions. And so, that remains out there. But Egypt believes that it hasn't prejudiced Turkey's ability to delineate a maritime boundary.
So it was able to please both Greece and Turkey in its handling of that particular negotiation.
Well, that's the Egyptian perspective. Yeah.
Right. It's not the Turkish perspective, which is
So what's the Turkish perspective on that, Nick?
Well, this is the problem that Turkey signed a maritime delimitation agreement with Libya, or with the GNA in particular, that was a dramatic extension of what had previously been understood as plausible Turkish claims in the region, and pretty much dismissed, widely recognized Greek claims, would have pushed Turkey's maritime border up to, I think, 12 nautical miles away from the island of Crete.
Wow.
And so part of the dilemma now is that because Turkey has staked out such an extravagant position, it's difficult, from Turkey's official point of view now, the very signature of a Greek-Egyptian delimitation agreement undermined Turkey's claims. And by the same extension, the very idea that Turkey could sign an agreement with Egypt, if you look at the map, would actually fundamentally undermine what Greece sees as its Greece continues to claim as its maritime territory. So there's the extent of Turkey's claims, and I guess you could add Greece's, make it just geographically impossible for Egypt to satisfy both of them. Which is one of the reasons Turkey's optimism now, I think, about signing a delimitation agreement with Egypt strikes observers as so impossible.
Yeah, so I just want the only follow up to that is that I think Egypt believes that the super maximalist claims have to be dialed back, right? I mean, there is no way to satisfy Turkey's original claims, and so I think Egypt assumes that if there is to be a kind of moving forward of the relationship and a sorting out in the Eastern Mediterranean, that something has to give, and from their perspective, it's the kind of the more maximalist Turkish claims.
We'll be right back after this break.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply, and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani, and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation, a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. You're listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. I'm talking to Nick Danforth, a senior visiting fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and Michael Wahid Hanna, a senior fellow here at the Century Foundation. We're talking about Turkey and Egypt, and also the tangled mess of relationships in the Eastern Mediterranean. I want to pick up on what we were talking about before the break with the sort of natural gas conflict, and then as sort of quickly as is reasonable, I want to bring in the U.S. relationship as it impacts all this. But first, let's try and tie up this question of the gas claims, because it seems to me like Turkey has pursued a pretty expansive vision of its importance in the region, and it's proven that it can even engage in overreach sometimes, or destabilizing actions like it did in Syria when it shot down the Russian plane and so on, and bounce back. So even if it does things that are widely viewed as delusional in its self-image of power, it turns out that it can weather those things and not really be not suffer major consequences for it. Now, that's been happening for the better part of a decade, and a lot of those conflicts are their armed conflicts, as in Syria and Libya, or their political conflicts, as in the support for Qatar and for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which all allow for a certain amount of ambiguity. Whereas drilling for natural gas in contested waters is not a space where you can muddle through with ambiguity. So it's a sort of rubber meets the road test. And I'm wondering, Nick, if you see a sort of this as a sort of catalyst for Turkey having to decide what it wants and how hard it wants to push, kind of maybe parallel to China in the South China Sea, when the sort of diplomacy shifted into becoming a real tangibly measured thing. And in that sweepstakes, what leverage does Turkey have to get its way?
Well, and that's what makes Turkish foreign policy, Erdogan's foreign policy, so hard to predict, and in the short term, at least, sometimes effective, is that there is this striking contrast between the willingness to stake out very bold, aggressive positions and sometimes defend them forcefully in ways that other countries don't expect, but then dial back those claims, step away from them, compromise in ways that are also much more pragmatic than people anticipate. And so the question of the East Med gas and Turkey's maritime delimitation claims is a perfect example of that. And Turkey did stake out these very maximalist claims with its agreement with Libya, which, as Michael said, everyone kind of assumes if they really want to have a rapprochement with other countries in the region, they're going to have to dial back. And yet, I think even for a lot of people in Ankara, it's unclear how seriously Erdogan is taking these claims. And whether, for a potential rapprochement with Egypt, he'd be willing to, I don't think ever officially abandon them, but just kind of put them on the back burner. And that's what we saw with Greece. Last summer, things really did escalate dramatically. Turkey was doing exploratory drilling in contested waters. There was a, direct confrontation. At one point, a Greek and Turkish warship actually collided with each other. The EU, which had been very slow to get tough with Turkey, was threatening sanctions. And at that point, Erdogan backed down. And is now engaging in exploratory talks with Greece over solving this issue. No one thinks it's actually going to be solved, but they're glad that the drilling has stopped. Turkey's back to having talks. And so, and this is why I think however limited the steps that Turkey took against the Muslim Brotherhood domestically were so striking, because it was, on what was seen as a very serious ideological issue for Erdogan, in which I think a lot of people were skeptical and remain skeptical that he'll offer real concessions. The fact that, this was the first sign of something tangible that he'd done, in pursuit of this rapprochement, made it suddenly seem like this business was a lot more serious. And I guess I just add, in the long term in Libya, this is going to be a big issue, because we've seen, the fighting. There was a moment last summer also when people were talking about Turkey and Egypt going to war over Sirte. That ended, and now there's been a pivot towards what seems like a more productive diplomatic approach. And yet you still have this question, and Turkey's been very sensitive about this in the negotiations to create a unified Libyan government, over what that would mean for the Turkish-Libya maritime deal. And if, is that something that Turkey would eventually be willing to give up if a government was formed in Libya that didn't recognize it? Or would that be something serious enough to Ankara that it would be willing to scuttle the negotiations in Libya? To me, at least, it's unclear.
And Michael, does Egypt have more leverage than it did just even 10 or 15 years ago, because of its regional posture, because of its military presence in Libya, or is it really a weaker party in this setup?
Yeah, I think Egypt is a diminished power. There's no question that Egypt doesn't fill the same regional role that it did, and it's been steadily declining. It has invested a great deal in a kind of military modernization, particularly on the naval side, thinking very clearly about the Eastern Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa. And it's important to note that, Egypt-Turkey tensions are not just Eastern Med, they're not just Libya. Turkey has tried to be a player in the Horn of Africa and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where Egypt is quite engaged. There were big Egyptian fears about what Turkey was doing with the previous Sudanese government around Suakin Island and the possibility of basing. And of course, Nick mentioned previously, the dispute with, or I don't know, maybe it was Euthanasia, the dispute with Qatar, the sort of Saudi-led blockade, where Turkey came in behind Qatar. And so Egypt and Turkey were on opposite sides of several big regional divides. So it's not that Egypt has kind of added leverage, but there are numerous geopolitical friction points that exist and mutual suspicions about what these two countries are up to. And there is and I think it's important to note that I think it's waning a bit, but there has been this ideological element. Egypt's regional policy in the early years after the coup were basically a direct projection of its domestic political priorities. And so,
You mean Islamism, Muslim Brotherhood style Islamism?
Islamism writ large. And so, Egypt was not particularly worried about the sectarian divide in the region. And so they're much more concerned about ISIS in Iraq and ISIS in Syria, say, and not particularly hung up with sectarian issues, and very anti-Muslim Brotherhood, which pushes them into conflict with Turkish positions, like in Libya. But we've seen recently a toning down of that, I think, ideological element on both sides to a degree, early stages of that. But the way in which Egypt has pivoted in Libya seems to suggest that they are trying to become slightly more pragmatic. We've seen the same with some of the Palestinian factions and Hamas. And so, that's where we find ourselves. I don't think that Egypt has a lot of leverage, but it has a lot of points of friction that have to be worked out with Turkey. One last point here is, Turkish-Egyptian relations didn't rupture in 2013. They obviously went into a much more difficult period, but trade has grown. So this isn't a case where they have to reestablish diplomatic contact or even business contacts. Alongside this very poor formal relationship between the governments, business has continued to grow. I mean, they signed an agreement in 2005, I believe, and so trade ties remain pretty robust.
All these things that you guys are saying raise a question for me that I hadn't thought about exactly in this way. When we look at all the regional tensions and the sort of the Cold Wars and hot wars within the region, we often hear about the U.S.-Iran tension. We hear about the interventions by Israel or things funded by the Gulf powers. But it seems to me like we might be underestimating the importance of these mid-level like Egypt or mid to large level like Turkey powers' capacity to, let's say, continue and deepen violent conflict and continue and deepen crises around the region, even if some of these other political cleavages are resolved. And I'm wondering if what we might be in for is a really protracted period where wars like Libya's and Syria's and conflicts like the one we're talking about in depth between Turkey and Egypt become ongoing drivers of conflict, both armed and political, because even mid-level or weak client powers like Egypt turn out to have significant ability to project power around the region. They're not simply passive objects in the relations and the conflicts going on. Is that something we should be thinking more about?
Well, I think in the post uprisings, regional landscape has changed. And you touch on one of the key points, and that is the willingness of regional powers to project power and to intervene militarily in other countries, right? So that's a kind of new feature. It's something that that looks quite different than the preceding years. Obviously there are things like the intervention in Yemen in the 60s by Egypt. So it's not that it's unprecedented, but it's something that has really accelerated in this post-uprisings landscape. Turkey has been a main driver of that in Libya, in Syria, but we've seen this from the Saudis and the UAE in Yemen, Libya and Egypt and the UAE in Libya. And so, Russia obviously intervened directly in Syria, is involved in Libya as well. So yes, I mean, this interventionism and willingness to use military force and to let loose military conflicts now across the region are clearly an important and very troubling factor in regional competition now. It's not in any way just the Cold War.
Intramural armed conflicts between rival sets of U.S. partners, right? I mean, in Libya in particular, we have on both sides of this war powers that are U.S. partners, or in Turkey's case, formal allies, often both sides using U.S. supplied weapons to fight each other, which seems I don't know. Maybe strategically it's not so dangerous. I don't know, but it seems like a development worth paying close attention to.
For Egypt and Turkey, I wonder if some of this as well is trying to be a productive diplomatic player in the region, right? And so, maybe they are not directly engaging with the United States, but from the U.S. perspective, Turkey and Egypt are big headaches all the time on domestic policy and regional policy. And so I wonder if in the back of both of their minds, the attempt to actually do something constructive and to dial down tensions doesn't have the United States kind of as a kind of ulterior motive. That for these two countries to be seen to be, trying to dial down tensions for once, as opposed to, engaging in more maximalist claims and stoking not just tension, but actual military conflicts in the region.
Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd add two things about that. I mean, one, no, I very much agree with you. I feel like we're having an increasingly heated debate in Washington about the U.S. role in the Middle East, U.S. interventions in the Middle East, in regards to retroactively about Syria, today still about Yemen. And I think it's fair to say that on both sides of this debate, there's sometimes a tendency to ignore the agency of countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt that maybe always, maybe increasingly, are going to have their own policies and are increasingly capable of causing problems and sometimes solving problems independent of what Washington wants them to do. So I think that's something more people here should be attentive to. And I also agree, look, I mean, this is why, it's not like an agreement between Erdogan and Sisi is going to herald a miraculous rebirth of the liberal international order and the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's still, it's a positive development precisely because, given the alternative, the alternative is increasing fragmentation, increasing violence, whatever cynical motives both sides might have, their own internal dynamics, or, as Michael said, a desire to temper criticism from the United States, that's something worth supporting. And, again, the fact that the fighting in Libya, at least temporarily, has stopped, that's good news for everyone.
I mean, from a U.S. perspective, we have this sort of crazy disproportional amount of our foreign military aid that goes into this region. We have so much, so many strategic headaches and some serious threats. We're mired in myriad spots. And when we look over this landscape, there are 4 countries that have a particularly close relationships with the United States, and in theory should be the cornerstone of effective influence. And those are Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Turkey. And Turkey at the top of that list because it's actually a formal ally within NATO. So those 4 countries should be the countries that are really actively helping promote U.S. interests in the region because of the colossal amount of military aid and other cover they get. I would argue that Egypt and Turkey have been actually the worst. However, so despite the sort of structural reasons why they should be anchors of U.S. policy, they are in fact huge spoilers and obstacles and sources of instability. I'm wondering, I mean, this could be wishful thinking. I'm wondering if either or both of them see this moment with Biden's election, with an increasing visible political consensus in the United States to end the forever wars and maybe even dial back our basic infrastructure in the Middle East and so on. If they think, maybe we're about to be called out and we're going to lose some of these huge amounts of money or military aid that we've grown entitled to over the last decades.
I mean, I would add the Gulf countries to that list. I think, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Qatar. I think when we see all of these U.S. partners on different sides of various regional conflicts, it points to a kind of incoherence to the U.S. approach to the region. U.S. ties with Qatar have not really diminished, even during the Trump administration. Despite the fact that there seemed to be an impulse to want to back the Saudi blockade at first. So they dialed back that policy, but it's hard for the United States to have a coherent regional policy when all of its regional partners are involved in various kinds of disputes and military conflicts against each other. That doesn't make any sense. That's where we find ourselves today. But it's not a coherent position, and it's a difficult one. And yes, I do think that I do think the timing with a new administration, I think it's a mistake to always center these around the United States. And there's a lot that happens in the region, like Nick was mentioning, that is just reflective of agency, what these countries want. But clearly there has been some renewed diplomacy around Yemen. There is renewed diplomacy around Libya. And so it does seem a moment, whether it can sustain itself or not is a separate question, but a moment in which various countries are thinking about changing tack in certain ways.
Nick, do you see any? I know this is a little far afield from our starting point of Egypt and Turkey. Do you see any potential for a sort of rebalancing between Turkey and the U.S., which have had such a contentious relationship now for so long through multiple administrations?
No. Short answer, long answer, both. No.
Good to have some clarity.
I preface this by. Part of the issue, to be fair, this U.S. frustration with our allies not being on the same page with Turkey and with Greece goes back a long time. For 70 years, throughout the Cold War, Washington's concern was that Turkey and Greece had their own priorities vis-a-vis each other and did not want to all focus on the Soviet Union all the time. But the reason I think that's gotten worse, it has gotten more incoherent, and also the reason that I think it is going to be difficult to have a kind of rebalancing between the U.S. and Turkey is that the kind of strategic vision that you hear repeated in Ankara increasingly seems to be that actually the way Turkey is going to get its rebalancing with the United States is by playing a more assertive regional role, is by throwing its weight around, is by showing that it's a major player, be it diplomatically or militarily in the region, and that the United States, in order to reap the benefits of that, has to accept it and has to embrace it. And so the fact that, I do think when Biden came in the midst of enormous geopolitical and domestic political and economic difficulties for Erdogan, there was a tendency or an instinct to dial things down and try to patch things up and at least preserve the illusion of continued good relations. But, I think to the extent that Ankara really does see its route to better relations with the United States in the long term is going through worse relations with the United States in the short term, that risks bad relations in both the short term and the long term.
Right. And it seems like the sort of, from the U.S. perspective, the worst behaviors of Turkey, like, buying a Russian anti-aircraft system, even though Turkey's in NATO, these sorts of things, which are really corrosive to fundamental trust, they're also things that Turkey can get away with because of its geopolitical importance, because of its size, because of the conflicts on its borders that it's involved in. And so I wonder if this is yet another one of these dissatisfying circumstances where we're likely to be stuck with this kind of dysfunction, and it's long-term sustainable because there's so much that the U.S. and the EU still need and still get from Turkey, even when Turkey behaves a bit as its own like empire-sized spoiler, that there's just nothing to be done about it. I was going to say, obviously there are things to do to try and manage the impact of these things. I don't mean throw up your hands and let them roll, but that we actually can't persuade them or have leverage over them to change any of these fundamental behaviors.
Right. And get away with it is a slippery term. And I think it's what's made this dynamic continue in that, I mean, that there's always talk on the EU and the American side of this enormous leverage that the West has over Turkey writ large, and this conviction that if only we used it, we could bring Turkey back in line. And the United States and the Europe have been very slow to use that, in part because of all the reasons you mentioned, that they feel like they are dependent on Turkey strategically. So they have been hesitant to use, and I think will continue to be hesitant to use the full force of their diplomatic and economic leverage. At the same time, what does getting away with it mean for Turkey? The country's economy is in far worse shape than it was a decade ago. A lot of that has to do with Erdogan's policies, but a lot of that has to do with Turkey's tensions with all of its neighbors. It's isolated in the region. It's not clear it's going to be able to overcome that isolation. It's developed this strange cooperative, competitive relationship with Russia, which has gotten it some real gains. And yet at the same time, the Turkish-backed forces, themselves are facing a potential catastrophe in Idlib. Turkey's, now continuing a decades-long insurgency against Kurdish separatists that's spread over into two different countries. So it's not. I think that, to your point, this is what makes the potential for kind of running ongoing dysfunction so real, that both Ankara and the Western capitals have enough reason to continue to make the kind of short-term compromises that will enable the dysfunctional relationship to muddle through. And yet the result certainly isn't good for Turkey, and in the long run isn't good for the West either.
In closing, Michael, one last question for you. Can you deduce from this particular episode with Egypt and Turkey that Sisi, despite his many shortcomings, has been shrewd as a diplomat, or what's your sort of read of his performance?
Well, I think he's been interesting at times as a diplomat. I think a little bit more nuanced than in terms of his approach to domestic governance. And the reason I say that is that, Egypt refused to intervene in Yemen at the following the calls to do so by the Saudis. They've been restrained in that sense. They've shied away from the sectarian, divisions in the region. They're not particularly concerned with Iran and Iranian pretensions to being some kind of a hegemon. And they've tried to construct power through partnerships. So we see this in the Eastern Med with Greece and Israel and Cyprus. We see it with the approach to Qatar through the blockade, and the ways in which Egypt has engaged in Libya, with partnering with the UAE and Russia to an extent. I think we've seen more pragmatic approaches of late in Gaza, in Libya, Egypt's also trying to do a kind of bandwagoning now with Sudan against Ethiopia. They both have these claims with respect to the dam project that Ethiopia is undertaking. And so Egypt is engaged now across the board in a way that it probably wasn't in late stage Mubarak era, when it
diplomatically moribund a decade ago.
Yeah, really focused on internal issues, just things like succession, and Egypt has, because it has interests at stake in all of these places, has had to really re-engage in places that it wasn't particularly engaged in, and that's where it finds itself now. It's a difficult set of situations for Egypt, and because of its diminished power, it doesn't have the ability to sort of effectuate policy change on its own, and so now it finds itself trying to work through partnerships to try to increase its leverage, and that's probably smart for Egypt in its current situation. And one last point, sort of muddling through in a way that reduces tensions, that, maybe that's the ceiling of our expectations. But it would be better than the kind of moment of far-flung, military engagements and interventions across the region. So, I don't have great hopes for what the coming months might unfold in the coming months. But if it's a kind of dialing down of tensions and a reduction of violence and conflict, that's better than where we've been. And so maybe that's how we should think about what's on tap.
Well, thank you both for coming on the podcast, and I found it really refreshing to talk about all these events with a sort of primacy of place to regional actors and not just to far away superpowers. You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. I've been joined today by Nick Danforth, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and Michael Wahid Hanna, a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation. Thank you both for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Thanasi.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the International Affairs podcast from the Century Foundation. If you've enjoyed what you heard, please rate us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll make it easier for other listeners to find us and help us to keep producing these conversations. Thanks for listening. Till next time.